Imagine this. You've spent weeks on a military mission, far from home, serving your country. You've fought battles, seen horrors, and faced unimaginable dangers. But nothing could prepare you for what you would walk into when you returned home. The door creaks open, and there she is. Your wife, the woman you love, the one you trust, is lying in your bed with another man. The betrayal is undeniable. The reality is worse than any enemy you've ever faced. And in the seconds that follow, everything changes. For one soldier from Texas, that moment led to a double murder, a life shattered, and a state left in disbelief. This wasn't just a murder. It was the result of a moment of raw emotion, a blind rage triggered by a devastating act of infidelity. But what happened next is far from what you might expect. In the aftermath, the story took twists no one could have predicted. A crime that would unfold into a tale of violence, regret, and questions that remain unanswered. Was this simply a crime of passion, driven by a moment of betrayal? Or was there something deeper, something that had been lurking in the shadows long before the trigger was pulled? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details of this Texas tragedy, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, love, and revenge. This story begins in the heart of Texas, where the unforgiving heat of the summer months can drive even the most level-headed people to their breaking point. It's a place where loyalty is expected, where duty to family, community, and country is valued above all else. But in the small, tight-knit city of Killeen, just outside the gates of Fort Cavazos, a shocking crime would soon shatter that sense of trust. This is where our story takes a turn, where a betrayal too deep to imagine would lead to irreversible consequences. Meet John Mwangi, a 42-year-old staff sergeant in the United States Army, stationed at Fort Cavazos, Texas. Known for his disciplined demeanor and unshakable commitment to his duties, John was a soldier you would never expect to cross. His life, however, was about to be turned upside down. With years of service behind him and a reputation for precision, his focus had always been on protecting his country and his family. But there was one thing even John couldn't protect: his marriage. Then there's Esther Gitao, 37, a sergeant and food safety inspector for the 1st Medical Brigade at Fort Cavazos. She too had served her country in various capacities, previously stationed at Naval Station Norfolk and Fort Knox. Esther had earned the respect of her peers, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering dedication to her work. But what no one knew was that beneath her professional exterior, a secret was taking root, one that would soon lead to devastating consequences. Esther's affair with another man, someone whose identity remains a mystery, would become the breaking point. A betrayal so shocking that it would send shockwaves through the very foundation of their marriage. A marriage built on trust, respect, and shared service to their country. But in the most intimate of moments, everything would be shattered. What began as a fleeting moment of passion would soon ignite a deadly chain of events. This all took place in Killeen, Texas, a city woven with the threads of military life. A place where soldiers and their families forge strong bonds, but also where the pressures of service and the demands of daily life can sometimes fracture even the most solid foundations. In the shadows of Fort Cavazos, beneath the weight of the soldier's oath, something was about to explode. It was February 21st, 2025, the day that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. John Mwangi, having just completed a grueling stretch of duty, was supposed to be spending time with his wife. But instead, he found himself caught in a moment he never could have imagined. It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed, the kind of day where a soldier, returning home from the front lines of military service, expects nothing more than peace and comfort. But as he pulled into the driveway of his home on Lake Crest Drive, Killeen, Texas, a familiar feeling washed over him, the weight of uncertainty, as though something wasn't quite right. John hadn't been told anything unusual. There were no signs that anything had changed in his absence, but something in the air was different. He entered his home to find an empty house, the kind of silence that screams louder than any noise. As he moved through the rooms, it wasn't until he reached their bedroom that he would discover the truth. There, in the space that was meant to be the most intimate and sacred place of their relationship, he found his wife, Esther, with another man. The betrayal was undeniable. Esther, the woman he had pledged his life to, was caught in the act of being unfaithful. In that moment, time seemed to slow. A knot tightened in John's chest, his mind racing as his heart pounded in his ears. The man in their bed wasn't just some stranger. It was someone who had been trusted, someone who had been invited into their home. The shock, the fury, the utter disbelief, it all collided in John's mind, overwhelming his ability to think clearly. He'd walked in expecting to be reunited with his wife, but instead, he was confronted with a nightmare. John's eyes locked on Esther, and for a split second there was a hesitation, an almost painful silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that comes with reconciliation or understanding. No, this was the silence before the storm. Esther's gaze met his, and what happened next was a blur of emotions, a flood of betrayal and anger that overtook him in an instant. It wasn't just her actions that tore at him. It was the violation of everything he had ever known about trust and loyalty. With his mind clouded by rage, John did the unthinkable. In a flash, he turned and retrieved his service weapon. The same weapon he had been trained to use in combat was now aimed at those who had shattered his world. The gunshots rang out, loud and sharp, echoing through the quiet house. The man in the bed collapsed almost immediately, his life stolen in an instant. Esther, the woman he had once shared his life with, followed swiftly. Both of them were dead, 2 lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The silence that followed was deafening, but it wouldn't last long. The sounds of gunfire had not gone unnoticed. Neighbors living in the nearby homes heard the sharp pops, their ears attuned to the sound of danger. It wasn't long before the Killeen Police Department was called to the scene, responding with urgency. By the time they arrived, they would find the aftermath of a crime that left no room for redemption. In the wake of those gunshots, what remained was a scene of heartbreak, violence, and confusion. How could a marriage built on years of service, respect, and love have descended into such brutality? What drove a man sworn to protect to take the lives of those closest to him? As the Killeen police arrived at the scene, the full scope of the horror began to unfold. The house, once a home filled with love and shared memories, now stood as a grim crime scene. Officers quickly made their way inside, and it didn't take long to confirm what they feared. Both Esther Gitau and her lover were dead, victims of gunshot wounds. Esther's lifeless body was found in their shared bed, the scene eerily reminiscent of the love and intimacy that once defined their relationship. The lover, too, was found in the room, a silent casualty of betrayal. His identity was still a mystery at that point, but it didn't take long for the investigators to piece together that Esther's affair had led to this devastating end. As police examined the scene, their attention turned to a chilling discovery. The couple's 2 young children, no older than 5 and 7, had been in the house during the shooting. The same house where their mother and her lover had been gunned down. The same house where they now stood, untouched by the violence that had erupted just moments earlier. Somehow they had been spared, but their lives, like the lives of their parents, would never be the same. The sound of those gunshots would be forever etched in their minds, a terrifying memory that would haunt them for years to come. The officers were left with the heavy burden of not only processing the crime, but also figuring out how to protect these innocent children from the brutal reality they had just witnessed. With the scene secured and the bodies removed, the focus shifted to locating John Mwangi. the man responsible for the carnage, the man who had, in a matter of seconds, destroyed everything he had once held dear. As word of the tragedy spread through Killeen, the police turned their attention to Fort Cavazos, where John had last been stationed. The base, a place that had once been a symbol of his service and discipline, now became the location of his downfall. John, the man who had spent years serving his country, was found there, quietly waiting, almost as if he had resigned himself to the inevitable. When the authorities arrived at Fort Cavazos, John didn't resist. There were no further acts of violence, no frantic attempt to flee from the scene of the crime. He didn't put up a fight. Instead, he complied with the officer's orders without question, allowing himself to be taken into custody. There was a quiet acceptance in his surrender, as though the weight of what he had done had already taken its toll on him. His arrest, however, only raised more questions than answers. What had pushed him to this breaking point? What could have led a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others to take the lives of those closest to him? As John Mwangi was escorted from Fort Cavazos to the local police station, his mind raced with the aftermath of his actions. Would he regret it? Could he ever explain what had driven him to kill his wife and her lover? And perhaps most haunting of all, what would become of the children left behind? The once proud soldier, now reduced to a man facing a future of uncertain justice, had no answers. In the hours following John Mwangi's arrest, the Killeen Police Department worked swiftly to piece together the events that had led to such a tragic and violent outcome. Early evidence from the scene suggested that this was, in fact, a crime of passion. There were no signs that the murders had been carefully planned or premeditated. The brutality of the act, John's immediate reaction to his discovery, pointed to a moment of explosive anger, one fueled by the overwhelming betrayal he had just witnessed. It wasn't an execution carried out with cold calculation, but rather a violent response to the devastation he had felt in that moment. The service weapon, a Glock 19 that John had used in combat, had been retrieved in a split second. The shots were fired rapidly, with little hesitation. Esther and her lover didn't stand a chance. The scene seemed to indicate that there was no prior thought, no pause for reflection, just pure emotion, rage, hurt, and confusion, all unleashed in a matter of moments. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, no signs that the couple had been under any kind of threat or duress from outside sources. The only clear threat in that house that day was the one John carried with him, the devastating weight of betrayal. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted to John's background. What had pushed this man, a soldier who had been trained to remain calm under extreme stress, to snap in such a violent way? Was there something deeper at play? Could there have been mental health struggles that had gone unnoticed by his family, friends, and fellow soldiers? For years, military families in Texas and across the country had grappled with the impact of service life, the long deployments, the unrelenting stress, the trauma of war, and the toll it took on their mental well-being. John was no exception. Could it be that the emotional weight of his work had built up over time, quietly eroding his capacity to cope? It wasn't long before investigators began to consider the psychological factors at play. The military lifestyle, particularly for someone like John, who had been stationed in high-pressure environments for years, was demanding, often leading to unspoken struggles with mental health. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety were all potential factors that had been slowly eroding John's mental state, though there had been no public signs that he was suffering. Was it possible that John's emotional toll, combined with his growing frustrations at home, had pushed him beyond his breaking point? Theories began to circulate within the community. Local residents, many of whom were also part of the military or had families stationed at Fort Cavazos, discussed the pressures of military life in hushed conversations. Some wondered if the high expectations of military discipline, paired with the loneliness of long separations and the struggle to adapt to civilian life after deployment, had played a role in John's actions. Could this be an example of the tragic outcomes that can arise when the emotional scars of war collide with the instability of personal betrayal? Others speculated that the affair itself, and the secrecy behind it, might have been a breaking point for John. Had Esther's betrayal been the final straw, or was it simply the trigger for a much deeper emotional crisis? Was there a growing sense of isolation and hopelessness that had been silently building between John and Esther? These were questions the community couldn't answer, but they couldn't help but wonder if there had been signs, things that those closest to the couple had missed. As the investigation continued, law enforcement uncovered new details about Esther's affair. The lover's identity remained undisclosed, but it was clear that the relationship had been ongoing for some time. The affair had been hidden, kept secret from John, and the emotional toll of this deception had weighed heavily on both John and Esther. For Esther, the affair was a way to find intimacy outside of a marriage strained by the pressures of military life. For John, it was a betrayal that shattered everything he thought he knew about loyalty and trust. As the community of Killeen watched the story unfold, the question of accountability grew. Was John solely responsible for this tragedy, or had the very nature of military life, its sacrifices, its demands, and its unseen emotional costs, played a role in the fatal turn of events? Could this crime have been prevented? And how many more families had been quietly suffering in similar ways, with no one truly understanding the pressures they were under? As the investigation into John Mwangi's actions reached its conclusion, the focus shifted to the legal proceedings. John was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, a crime that sent shockwaves through the small town of Killeen, Texas. The weight of the evidence against him seemed undeniable. John had confessed to the killings, and the brutal nature of the murders was clear. Yet, as the trial loomed, the question of whether justice would truly be served began to take shape in the hearts and minds of the people of Texas. The court proceedings began with the opening arguments, and right from the start, the tension was palpable. The defense, led by a skilled attorney, quickly presented their case. They argued that John Mwangi was not the cold-blooded killer that the prosecution painted him to be. Instead, they focused on his years of dedicated military service, highlighting his role as a staff sergeant at Fort Cavazos. His service, they argued, was marked by discipline, loyalty, and a commitment to his country, qualities that seemed at odds with the violent outburst that had occurred in his home. The defense also presented a crucial piece of their argument: John's mental health. They suggested that the stresses of military life, combined with the trauma John may have endured during his years of service, could have contributed to a breakdown of his mental state. They pointed to the potential psychological toll of his job and the emotional strain of his personal life. Was it possible that John's overwhelming emotions, exacerbated by his service and compounded by the betrayal he experienced, had led to a loss of control? This, they argued, was not premeditated murder, but a tragic act born out of emotional turmoil. On the other side, the prosecution was resolute in their stance. They painted a very different picture of John Mwangi. To them, his actions were nothing less than a calculated and brutal murder. They argued that John had planned the killings, and the fact that he had used his service weapon, an instrument of authority and power, showed his intent to take control in the most violent way possible. The prosecution emphasized the pain and suffering caused not only to Esther and her lover, but also to their young children, who would have to live with the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. In a case like this, there was no middle ground. It wasn't a question of whether a crime had been committed. It was a question of what had driven John to commit it. Was he a victim of his own circumstances, trapped by the pressures of military life and personal betrayal? Or was he a cold-blooded killer, capable of extraordinary violence in the face of his emotions? As the defense and prosecution made their closing arguments, the jury was left to deliberate. The courtroom, filled with spectators and family members, sat in tense silence as the decision loomed. Was there enough evidence to suggest that John's mental health had played a significant role in his actions? Or was this simply a case of someone who had lost control and taken matters into their own hands, resulting in the irreversible loss of two lives? The jury deliberated for several days, and when they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. The four persons stood, their voice steady as they read the verdict aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, John Mwangi, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The room fell silent as the words echoed in the courtroom. For many it was a moment of relief, a sense that justice had been served for Esther and her lover, both of whom had tragically lost their lives in a senseless act of violence. But for others, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Was John truly a monster, or was he a man broken by circumstances beyond his control? The debate raged on. John Mwangi was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. For some, it was a fitting punishment for a crime that could never be undone. For others, the sentence failed to account for the complexities of his life and the emotional turmoil he had faced. As John was led away in handcuffs, the people of Killeen were left to reflect on the tragedy that had unfolded within their community. A life lost, a family shattered, and a haunting question that lingered in the air. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Justice, in this case, was served, but for everyone involved, the consequences of that fateful day would never be fully erased. As we reflect on the devastating consequences of betrayal and heartbreak, we're left with one lingering question. In the heat of betrayal, what drives a person to commit such irreversible acts? Is it a sudden loss of control, a culmination of years of hidden pain, or something deeper? We want to hear what you think. Share your thoughts below in the comments. This case, like so many others, reminds us of the fragile nature of human emotions and the shocking outcomes when those emotions are pushed to their breaking point. If you're captivated by true crime stories, especially those rooted in Texas, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We dive into the most chilling and thought-provoking cases every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all our new content. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and share it with anyone who loves a deep dive into the darkest corners of true crime.